also. Well, let's identify it briefly. What is today's date? It's November
16th.
16th, 1997. Recording session with gave Celia Utechin and Walter Uhler and George Enteen are conversing with him about matters of mutual interest. And the first question we've decided to deal with is Sir Isaiah Berlin, your knowledge of him, your friendship with him.
Yes, I first met him soon after I first arrived in England in February 1950. I was lucky. I was given a scholarship at Oxford University and was placed at New College. You have to be a member of the college at Oxford in order to be a student there. And Isaiah Berlin was a fellow of that college and tutor in philosophy at that college. It was arranged without my knowledge or agreement that I should read what is known in Oxford technically as PPE, philosophy, politics, economics, and colloquially as the modern greats. The classics are known there as greats, and this is the modern greats. And he was to be my tutor in philosophy. Partly for that reason, and partly because he was Russian, I was introduced to him very soon after my arrival. And although I stupidly, as I later realized, declined that program that they had arranged for me, I continued to see him rather frequently. He was living in the college. He was not married then, and was living in New College. I had his rooms, this is the technical term, in Oxford there. Students would have typically one room. Fellows, teachers, would have two rooms, a bedroom in the back and a room for everything else in front. And Isaiah Berlin had that arrangement. And since I could speak Russian to him, and I couldn't speak English at the time, thank God there were enough people who spoke either Russian or German in Oxford at that time. I was able to
What year did you arrive in England? What year did you arrive?
1950.
In this very year.
February 1950. And I frequently saw him in his rooms, and we talked about everything, anything and everything under the sun. As you know, he was a great conversationalist. It was also an advantage for me that we talked in Russian, because his Russian was slightly slower than his English was. His English apparently had at one point been recorded, and he produced about 400 words a minute, about twice the speed of a normal speech, apparently, a normal English speech.
Sergei Vasilyevich, was this due to his vocal cord problem? Would you know?
No idea. I doubt it. There was no knowledge or mention of it at the time. Uh, he just spoke extremely rapidly, and there are people who do speak rapidly. I remember my father told me that one of his pupils had been a stenographer at the Duma, and usually there were two stenographers working when Duma members spoke. But when Purishkevich spoke, four of them were working because the two stenographers couldn't take it down fast enough. He apparently spoke so fast, and at least he was similar to Isaiah Berlin in that respect. However different they must have been in various other respects. And so he tried to convince me that I should take that program, even if I was averse to the Oxford philosophy, which he would have had to teach me in order to prepare me for the examination. He, by that time, had already become disillusioned in the Oxford philosophy, but he would have had to teach me that philosophy to prepare me for the examination. And he said that even if I disliked it, it was preferable to criticize from within, like himself, than to try to attack it from outside. Now, I was stupid enough not to follow his advice and other people's advice. So he wasn't actually my teacher in that direct sense. He wasn't my tutor. I didn't have to see him once a week with a paper prepared for discussion. But I saw him frequently, and he was one of the main sources of my information about the world. I just arrived from Germany, England, and the world in general. And he obviously was an extremely interesting person to talk to. I felt it immediately, and took every opportunity I had of talking to him. The arrangements in Oxford, at least then, were that if the fellows' rooms usually had two doors, a double door, and if the outer door was open, you could walk in. Well, you could knock, but it meant that he wouldn't mind. If the outer door was closed, then it meant that he wouldn't want to be disturbed. There might have been a tutorial in progress there, or whatever other reason. So one would just go up and see whether the outer door was open.
But I know your understanding of him was then, and also you remained in touch with him through the years, and also your wife then, Pat, began to work with him.
Yes.
And through her, you could probably say something about his work methods.
Yes. Pat has been working as his secretary for a long time. She started, I think, in '62. Then we went to Glasgow in '65, and there was an interruption of 7 years, duration. But then she came back to Oxford and resumed working as his secretary, and she's still there. He practically never wrote anything by hand. Postcards. He wrote postcards when he was away, even from London. He sometimes wrote postcards to her. Particularly when he was away, they had a every summer they would go to Europe and he would write postcards. But everything else he dictated. He, if it was a lengthy text, he would record it on a tape recorder. Thank God, because now there are voice recordings, which is important. And she would transcribe. If it was something brief, he would just dictate to her, or even say this and this. And of course, during the last few months, since July, she just handled his correspondence. He couldn't. He was unable to do that. He read an enormous amount of stuff. Always.
Any idea of how many languages that she read?
His first language had been Russian. He knew German normally from childhood. It was his second language. Yiddish was not spoken at home. He didn't actually know it. He didn't read it. English was his third language. He learned it quickly. And French in London at school. He was reputed to be able to speak half a dozen languages. So we have Russian, German, English, French, Italian, I'm practically certain. He didn't speak Hebrew. He was able to read it to some degree. It was mentioned in one of the obituaries that he had had bar mitzvah in London. He didn't speak. He didn't speak Israeli Hebrew. So I'm not sure what he in the secondary school at St. Paul's in London. His main efforts were in Greek and Latin Greek. So he read Greek freely without any difficulty, and Latin. But of course, those languages were not spoken. So I'm not sure what the other two languages were.
Do you think he would know the other Slavic languages? Ukrainian,
He
Polish?
could read, but he didn't. He didn't. He found it awkward, and I'm not surprised. I don't blame him for finding it rather awkward. They are so similar. Reading is easier. Speaking is more difficult because you are in danger constantly of switching from one to another language. I don't think he spoke Polish or Czech, but he could read. I know he could read them, but didn't speak. Yes.
Well, I had sidetracked you. We were talking before. About Pat's work with him. Now, I had the impression from you that she helped organize his work.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Very, very much so. It's very interesting. On the one hand, he was well organized in his mind. On the other hand, he was anything but organized in his life. It was extremely fortunate that he got married finally. His now widow is the opposite. She's a very well organized person, and she arranged for him to live an organized and comfortable life. She's very wealthy, and he was pampered by her, and that was excellent. As far as his work was concerned, that was mostly responsible for that. He would find it very difficult to remember whether he had a passport, whether it was renewed, whether he had got the tickets to the opera that he wanted to have, and he would say he hadn't received them. Pat said, "Oh yes, you have." "No, I haven't." She would then go and find them in his jacket pocket or whatever. Here you have. He would always apologize excessively humbly. He said he would crawl on his knees. Well, they were very friendly, obviously. But that was a general characteristic of his. I'm not aware of any enemies. He doesn't seem to have had any enemies. People were either admiring him or found him difficult to comprehend. They would approach him from their own standpoint as, let's say, an English philosopher or a Russian intellectual, I suppose of a Zionist activist or whatever, and they would all find him inadequate. From their point of view, he abandoned the Oxford philosophy. He was a Russian intellectual. Most certainly, he was a Russian intellectual, but he wasn't. He wasn't intolerant. He wasn't. What's the word I'm looking for? He wasn't intolerant. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't intemperate, and that, of course, is a very peculiar character. He was too Russian for English philosophers. He was too English for Russian intellectuals. He was not enough of a Zionist for Zionist activists. He once told me that he had refused to shake what's his name?
Begin?
Begin's hand, because Begin had been a part of the terrorist campaign in the then Palestine. This was his kind of Zionism. He thought that Jews should be able, if they chose, to live in a country they could feel was theirs, and didn't have to live as members of a minority among people, some part of whom, some percentage of whom might be anti-Semitic and were almost bound to be anti-Semitic. So that was his kind of Zionism. No compulsion, no idea of settling all the Jews in Israel or whatever. But that there should be the possibility of a choice, that a person should be able freely to choose. And to choose what in particular, to be able to live in a country.
You know, this to me suggests maybe another way of talking about him. The choice, it reminds me of Kant, and you talked about him once of being a neo-Kantian or having.
Well, without ever saying that, I think he was a neo-Kantian in many respects, but he hardly ever mentioned them. He certainly talked about Kant, but not about neo-Kantians. Choice was a very important concept for him. Which I find particularly attractive. I'm not sure to what extent these various views of mine are the result of his influence. His influence was never obtrusive. He never imposed on anybody.
Are any of your teachers more influential on you than he was, would you say?
Again, as I say, it's difficult to say. I keep finding points of contact, but I can't trace the roots of those views as clearly as I probably should be able to. Quite obviously, the concept of choice is there. But I'm not sure whether this is the influence of Berlin or perhaps of Collingwood's question. Mm-hmm. Collingwood insisted on question. Now, so does Berlin. Mm-hmm. But that was a later. One must remember. I must remember that when I first met him in 1950, very little of his had been published yet. Karl Marx was the main published work by him. His reputation and his influence were mostly the result of conversations rather than publications. And it is perfectly possible, though I simply don't remember now, it is perfectly possible that I had read Collingwood's The Idea of History before I could have had any direct influence in this direction by side of it.
And your friendship with Oakeshott came later.
I wouldn't call it a friendship. I met him very soon. He was at that time was a fellow of Nuffield, a graduate college in Oxford, and the only graduate college in Oxford. And graduate students were typically, and I felt myself, rather uncomfortable in Oxford. Oxford was an ideal place for undergraduates, but graduate students were an oddity in Oxford. It sort of sounded American or whatever. And in New College, where I first found myself, there was really no place for a graduate student. They didn't really know what to do with a graduate student. And Nuffield was already there. It was the first graduate college in Oxford, just for graduate students, founded by Lord Nuffield, the English small fort as it were, the car manufacturer. And Oakeshott was a fellow of Nuffield then, and Pat was working as a secretary at Nuffield. And so she knew Oakeshott, and they were rather friendly. They played tennis and things like that. And so she very soon introduced me to Oakeshott.
Sergei Vasilyevich, would you, maybe this is a time to talk about, you mentioned that Berlin was disillusioned with the Oxford system.
Yeah,
What-
Oxford philosophy.
Oxford philosophy.
Oh
Would
no,
you-
no, no, no! Oxford philosophy. That is a very specific term. A group of young philosophers in Oxford in the 30s, including Freddie Eyre, later Sir Alfred Eyre, and Austin, and Stuart Hampshire, who now I believe lives in Menlo Park, and Isaiah Berlin, and one or two others, met regularly at Isaiah Berlin's rooms in All Souls. He was a fellow of All Souls at the time, and discussed philosophical matters. They didn't record their conversations, and as soon as they thought they had enough discussion on one point, they moved to another, without recording. They were interested passionately interested in the truth, as it were, but not in communicating the truth to anybody else. And the truth they were interested in was very esoteric. Analysis of the language, of how this or that idea might be expressed. And it became, as far as I can see, more and more esoteric. They were moving away from the world, as it were, and were creating an ever-expanding world of words and grammatical forms and sentences.
Smacks of postmodernism, the way you put it.
Yes.
Seems the influence of Wittgenstein quite a bit.
Oh, most certainly.
Yes,
Most certainly.
yes,
Wittgenstein
yes.
was very influential.
Yes.
Oh, certainly. I'm aware of this similarity also, but they were decent. So, but Isaiah Berlin became disillusioned. He records it. It has been also recorded here by various authors of the.
Would you like to take a break?